Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the May Society of Army Historical Research online talk. Our speaker this evening is Carole Divall, and I'm going to invite her on stage in a second, but we've been having a few technical issues, and if she continues to have these issues, then I think what we're going to do is just ask her to be audio only and not appear on camera. But we're going to sort that out in a second. At the moment, I'd just like people to introduce themselves in the chat box and assure me that you are all there in the audience. At the moment, I've got 30 people who are showing as being attending. And good evening, Christopher from France. So it's working. Yes, just a few housekeeping issues before we start. And I normally go through this for a brief moment to give people the opportunity to come into the room. So everybody who has registered for the event will receive a copy of the recording either this evening or certainly by first thing tomorrow morning. And we've had once again a healthy registration for this talk. And so for that we are very grateful, particularly on an evening where there seems to be at least 2 other webinars which will draw the attention of the Society. The Society's secretary, Andrew Bamford, is in fact hosting another talk for Hellion this evening on a Napoleonic theme, which has really caused 1 or 2 members to have a real crisis of identity. Do I listen to this talk or do I listen to Carole's talk? Well, of course, by ensuring that everybody who signs up for these talks gets a copy of the recording, we take that dilemma away from you. The second thing I wanted to come across, talk to you about are the immediate action drills if you have any difficulty with your audio or with your video this evening. And once again, the regular attenders will know that I go through this. The first IA drill that you can employ if you have problems with your audio or your video is to press the refresh button. And the refresh button on most browsers is that incomplete circle with an arrow on it. And that will normally sort out any difficulties you may be experiencing. The second IA drill is to leave the webinar and return using the same unique link. And if the first IA drill hasn't sorted the issue, the second normally does. And finally, the third IA drill that you can employ, if neither of those works, and if you have access to a different browser, is to use the link in a different browser. So perhaps you might be watching this in Chrome or Firefox, but you can also be watching it in Microsoft Edge and Safari. So those are the 3 IA drills. And if you are really unfortunate and none of them work, then you are at least assured that you will get a copy of the recording. Now, what I'm going to do now is ask Carole to come on stage and see whether her technical difficulties have continued. So, Carole, can I ask you to join me on stage? Thank you. So, at the moment, I can see you and I can hear you.
That's a miracle.
I would be grateful, please, for people in the audience, if the Carole's, her video feed freezes, could you please tell me in the chat box so I know it's not just me? And if that happens, Carole and I have agreed that I will turn her camera off remotely and she will continue to speak to us by audio. So it falls to me to introduce Carole this evening. Carole is a retired head of English literature at Sleaford Girls' School in Lincolnshire. And she initially started life at university by doing a joint honours in English literature and history. And you would have thought, therefore, that she would have gone on to teach history. But in fact, she was very successful teaching English literature and left history, if you like, to be her own private sideline. She was telling me before we started this evening that at one stage in her career, the school asked her to lead an AS in critical thinking for the high flyers in her school. and she decided that they would examine the life of Napoleon and certain aspects of this life. And it was only near the end of that particular part of the curriculum that one of the very bright students in the class said, excuse me, miss, who was Napoleon? So I think that may well have led her down the track. I said this, but she said no, she'd already been a real interest in the Napoleonic era. And she was already at that stage researching her first book about the 30th Regiment. And subsequently, her exploits in this field has led her to become a fellow of the International Napoleonic Society. And her latest book is on Victoria and General Abercromby, who we're going to hear a lot more about now. So, Carole, I think that's enough by way of introduction. I'm really looking forward to this talk. As I said to you, I was reading up on Egypt 1801 the other day. So I'm going to leave the stage now. And as I said, if anything happens with your video feed, people in the audience, please let me know. Over to you, Carole.
Right. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be talking, even if it is at a distance, and to be talking about somebody who I actually came across for the first time when I was researching the 30th Foot, because they were one of the regiments that were involved in the 1801 Egypt campaign, which, if you look at the title, as I imagine you have it in front of you, was perhaps the point where the British Army really did get a taste for victory. It isn't normal, I think, to start a talk that's about a man and commence with a eulogy, but because of what I want to lead up to, I thought we would consider one of the many, and it would be here all night, I think, if I read them all to you, all the many eulogies that followed General Abercromby's death in 1801. This one is from the Commander-in-Chief of the Army at that point, Frederick, Duke of York. The splendour of his actions in the field and the heroism of his death are worthy of the imitation of all who desire, like him, a life of honour and a death of glory. That is, I think, a peculiarly late 18th, early 19th century sentiment, but nonetheless, those are words which I hope, as I go through this talk, you will also decide that Sir Ralph Abercromby deserved. So just a bit of background biography, so to speak. As you can see by the standards of the time, when he died in 1801 on active service, he was certainly an elderly general. However, he wasn't initially intended for the army. He was the son of a laird who owned a lot of land in Clackmannanshire, Perthshire, and who was himself a very distinguished lawyer. And it was with that in mind that Abercromby, first of all with a private tutor, then a very famous school in Scotland, and I have to confess that until I was studying Abercromby, I'd never heard of it. It's the School of Mr. Moore in Alloa, which, despite its Jacobite, shall we say, sensitivities, was the place to send your sons. Then off to Rugby School, Edinburgh University, moral and natural philosophy and civil law, and to continue his studies of civil law, Leipzig University. And it was when he was in Leipzig that he decided it wasn't law he wanted to study, it was a military career that he was drawn towards. He seems, when he was studying civil law, to have been keeping an eye on the Prussian military with increasing respect for them. As a result, a cornetcy in the 3rd Dragoon Guards was purchased for him. He saw service in the 7 Years' War. I'm saying saw service rather than active service because it's a bit uncertain whether he actually did see any active service. What he did see, though, was the methods of Frederick the Great and the Duke of Brunswick, and became increasingly impressed by the command methods of these two men. By 1773, he was Lieutenant Colonel in the 3rd Dragoon Guards, brevet colonelcy followed. And then, interestingly, he became a colonel in the King's Irish Infantry. Now, of course, we're at the time of the American War of Independence, and Abercromby made it quite clear that he would actually refuse to fight if he was posted on the basis that it was a civil war. That was how he saw it, and no soldier should be asked to fight or forced to fight in a civil war. He was, in fact, very sympathetic towards the colonists and thought it was a matter of democracy. By 1783, he was on half pay, appeared to live the life of a laird, although his father was still alive, and also quite a sort of intellectual man. He used to spend time attending lectures at Edinburgh University, quite high-powered stuff as well. So let's leave Abercromby for a moment then, seemingly a military career that's come to an end. And if he was of the same mindset as this man, William Pitt, then he might have thought, well, that is it. There's not going to be a war. I'm sure you can read this yourself, but as you can see, this is Pitt in 1792, spring budget, announcing some drastic reductions in the money being given to the Navy and the Army, because he is so confident that looking at the situation in Europe, we might more reasonably expect 15 years of peace than we may never perhaps have expected 15 years of peace than we may at the precise moment. This is quite odd. 1792, the French Revolution, of course, is well in its stride. And there's certainly stirrings that other states are becoming concerned. And of course, the irony is that in February 1793, when the French executed the king, and we kicked out the French ambassador, and they declared war on us, Pitt's attempts at telling the future were obviously very much mistaken. If there was going to be a war, then there were certain politicians who would be driving the form of that war took. And it was fairly obvious that a war was going to be fought. Pitt himself, his main concern was to reduce the national debt. It's one of the, if you like, tragic ironies of his career, that the thing that in other circumstances he might well have achieved, he was unable to, because war is a very expensive business. On the left, we have the Foreign Secretary, Lord Grenville. On the right, the Minister for Colonial Affairs, Henry Dundas, and of course then Pitt himself. The interesting thing is that Grenville and Dundas saw the best way to attack the French in quite different terms. For Grenville, it was all a matter of building up coalitions, working with allies, excuse me, and obviously finally overwhelming the French. Dundas took a slightly different view. He was, of course, very much concerned with British colonies, but very aware of how much the French drew resources from their colonies. And he therefore believed in a more economic approach, attack the French colonies, deprive them of income, and they wouldn't have the means to fight a war. And as we shall see, Abercromby was to, if you like, experience both those forms of warfare. Well, if you're going to fight a war, you obviously need an army. This, of course, is a somewhat satirical view of the British Army at the time we're now talking about 1793. To say the army was not highly regarded, I think, is, well, almost an understatement. And I have here a nice summary of how it was perceived. This is the view of Henry Bunbury, who was well familiar with what the sort of men he was talking about and the sort of system he was talking about. Our army was lax in discipline, entirely without system, and very weak in numbers. Each colonel of a regiment managed it according to his own notions or neglected it altogether. There was no uniformity of drill or movement. Professional pride was rare, professional knowledge still more. So never was a kingdom less prepared for a stern and arduous conflict. Every department of the staff was more or less deficient, particularly the commissariat and medical branches. The regimental officers in those days were, as well as their men, hard drinkers, and the latter, under a loose discipline, were much addicted to marauding and to acts of licentious violence. It was a failing system. To just extrapolate from Bunbury's views, we can sum that up. There was no supervisory system, no organised system of logistics. Many of the battalions were no more than skeleton battalions. There was no common training, and as Bunbury points out, in some units there was no training at all. No efficient recruiting system, and in a sense, no recruits. This is the age of crimping, when desperate measures managed to get some men into the ranks. The result was that the army in total was about 40,000 strong, but 58 battalions were serving abroad. Abroad did include Ireland, and only about 15,000 men were available for home service. Now, this was against a country that, under the influence of Carnot, was becoming a nation in arms. It was going to be a very unequal struggle. However, there was a man, not the greatest commander in the field, it has to be said, but a man who showed great talent for organisation. This is, of course, Frederick, Prince of Wales. Frederick, Duke of York, rather. Prince of Wales, Frederick, Duke of York. And he set about, and it was a long process, this didn't all happen in a matter of minutes, but he set about improving the system. It was a systematic, I suppose, improvement, for want of a better word, that was actually needed. For example, the Volunteers Acts actually brought men into the army. It enabled the militia to release men into the regulars. It wasn't initially particularly successful. The first of the Volunteers Acts was 1794, and the reason was very simple. You could be sent to the West Indies, and nobody in their right mind wanted to be sent to the West Indies. So in 1796, men who came in via the Volunteer Act or from the militia didn't have to serve outside Europe. And that led to a great increase in volunteers. Another problem, of course, was the quality of the officers. Recruiting for rank was, of course, one way to get promotion. But we all know there were young men, boys even, holding commissions who were certainly not of an age to fight. And we also know of the very, very rapid promotion that was possible if you were wealthy. Of course, the classic example is a certain Arthur Wesley, later, of course, the Duke of Wellington. But I don't think just one example justifies the system. And that was something else that York did something about. You had to serve for a specific time in a rank before you could be promoted. He also did a lot of work on the Quartermaster General's department, which was singularly inefficient. And then we have one of the things that Bunbury mentioned, drill. This is an image of David Dundas, and next to it is his Principles of Military Movements. Now, this was actually quite controversial. Those who were opposed to it said it was a sort of cut and dried system, very inflexible, and all right, you'd be able to get all your men moving together, as it were. But if they were in a situation where that wasn't the required, wasn't actually required, then they wouldn't be able to do anything else. In actual fact, if one looks at what York said about this, he made it absolutely clear that, yes, this is a training manual, but soldiers should also be taught other maneuvers which they might need. So they were flexible and ready for whatever circumstances they found themselves facing. And actually, to that point, it's interesting to note that the 1st Rifled Battalion, the 5th 60th, actually under York's influence, was set up in 1798. He had actually, just jumping ahead a moment, seen the value of light infantry in Flanders, the first of the campaigns I'm going to consider in a moment, and that was the long-term result. So back to Abercromby, who would find himself in a position of command in this very inadequate army. And it has actually been said of the army at that point, and it was by Lady Holland, the politician's wife, how harmless an English military forces against an enemy in battle array. No patriotism there. Another view of what happened in the early years of these revolutionary wars was that the war was made up, as far as England was concerned, of idiotic expeditions in which a little army was dispatched to make a raid somewhere for no particular reason, and with instructions to hurry back as soon as things looked serious. As you can see, nobody taking the British Army too seriously at this point. This, of course, is the French army. This is the one that, under Carnot's influence, it may not have the discipline, the principles of maneuver and so on and so forth, but of course it has manpower and it has spirit. It's fighting for a cause. This is an image indeed from the Flanders campaign of 1793 through to 1795. Now, this was very much Grenville's work, a coalition pulling in the Austrians and the Prussians, who of course were already at war with France, the Dutch, because they'd been declared war on by France when we were. Eventually the Spanish came in as well. The problem with it was that everybody had different objectives. Ultimately to defeat the French, but how you defeated the French, and even more significantly, what you could get out of it for yourself, often of course in the form of land, meant that there wasn't the singularity of purpose that really efficient coalition needs. There were some successes. Certainly a lot of the border fortresses fell into Allied hands. Initially, the Prussians likewise were very much involved and pushing on the Rhine against French territory. The Prussians, however, or rather the Prussian king, was not committed, and eventually the Prussians made peace with the French, and that was a large part of the coalition falling apart. The time came, and it was actually a distraction rather than anything that was happening in Flanders that led to the Austrians pulling out. They had another issue to worry about, and this perhaps was something that Grenville took time to get his head around. The other issue in this case was Poland. Poland already partitioned, and with Russia and Prussia looking greedily to add to what they'd already taken, and Austria determined not to be left out, eventually, the war wasn't going well for them anyway, Austria also made peace with France. And that really left the British forces with no choice but to retreat. And it was a long retreat. By this time, the large proportion of the Dutch population were pro-French. They would, of course, eventually get one of Napoleon's brothers as their king. And there was no choice but to retreat north right up to to the North German ports where naval ships would lift them off. It was a horrendous retreat. It actually started in January, so terrible weather conditions, and bringing up the rear with the guards whom Abercromby had actually commanded right through the Flanders campaign, and also the sick. And a contemporary, when it was all over, wrote, "The active and humane mind of General Abercromby had ample scope for exertion. He conducted the harassed army from Deventer to Mildenzaal, through roads made impassable, in clement weather, and surrounded by an infuriated enemy. It was in the course of this arduous retreat that the unbounded philanthropy of the veteran general was so strongly evinced." It was one of the first experiences of a certain James McGrigor, who was a surgeon to the 88th at that point. And he certainly was very struck by the way that Abercromby managed to keep the army going, seemed never to lose his temper, just encouraged rather than hectored, I suppose we might say. So there we are. That is Britain's first attempt to make war on the continent, and it ended in failure. There's no two ways about it. As far as Abercromby was concerned, his next experience of war was to be under the influence of Dundas, who was actually a cousin of his mother, so they were related, and this would be to the West Indies. Now, there'd already been one British expedition to the West Indies, Grey and Jervis's expedition, which led to the taking of Martinique and, in fact, temporarily to St. Lucia. So Abercromby was to be sent in 1795, same year that, end of 1795, the same year that he'd come back from Flanders, to build on that success, try and take more French territory, but also because the French had enfranchised their slaves, deal with problems that were troubling the plantation owners, who of course expected the British government to send an army over. The problem with sending armies to the West Indies was, of course, the attrition rate, which could be as high in a year as 50% of a battalion, as men, of course, who were not acclimatized, who had no resistance to things like yellow fever and so on, had little chance of survival if they caught some of these diseases. Abercromby had the time to prepare for this expedition, and one of the things he did was hold what I suppose today we'd call a conference. He particularly consulted with Gray about the conditions that he had found in the West Indies. He also called in as many medical experts as he could with experience of the West Indies. And from the result of those discussions, he actually drew up very clear general orders which were designed to protect the health of the men. He was due to sail, and indeed did set sail, at the end of 1795, November 1795, in a fleet commanded by Admiral Christian. Unfortunately, they sailed out of Portsmouth and didn't get very far. What is still known down in that part of the world, I'm thinking of Dorset, Portland, as Christian's Storm, meant that so many ships were wrecked as they went around Portland Bill that the whole lot had to return to Portsmouth, and it wasn't until early in the next year that they finally set sail. It does actually bring up one point. I'm trying to build up a picture of Abercromby as we go, and one of his qualities, much commented upon by people who've written about him like Piers Mackesy, was his ability to deal with senior naval officers. Apparently this was a rare talent, and you needed it if you were going to have any success. Now, I don't think Admiral Christian was actually a particularly difficult naval officer, but as we shall see, there was another one who would actually give Abercromby a lot more trouble, more problems to deal with. At the second attempt, they set off. St. Lucia was the first objective, and it was successfully taken. And again, this is where the Army-Navy cooperation came into play. Admiral Christian was happy to take Abercromby's decision as to where the landing should be. He then made sure that the landings worked. They didn't always, of course. And he was quite happy that his sailors should help pulling guns across, all that sort of thing. So to cut it short, because I'm well aware of time here, it was successful. The island was taken, and in fact, Abercromby was able then to go on to deal with some trouble in St. Vincent and Grenada, then go on to Trinidad, and this is what this is an image of. Trinidad, of course, was Spanish, and by this time the Spanish were no longer enemies of the French. They too had made peace. So surprised were the Spanish by the, and so panicked by the arrival of Abercromby that they actually blew up their ships, and the British just landed, and that was it. They took Trinidad. The next objective was Puerto Rico. That proved a much harder nut to crack. In fact, it proved impossible to crack. But with St. Lucia, Trinidad in British hands, St. Vincent, Grenada now pacified, Abercromby, who was definitely suffering in the climate, decided that he'd done his duty and resigned his command and came back to Britain. There was a brief interval at this point, since we're concentrating on Abercromby's military career and also the army that was developing at this point. it is something of an interlude. He was sent to Ireland. And I suppose it was, or he would have agreed himself, his biggest failure. We know that Wellington had a very low opinion of his soldiers at times. I think Abercromby's opinion of the British soldiers in Ireland was probably even worse, and he notably sent a general order, the gist of which was that thanks to the lack of discipline coming from the officers, these were men who were more of a danger to their friends than they were to their enemies. I'm rather glossing that. The powers that be in Ireland, the ascendancy, did not approve. They worked consistently against him, and in the end he resigned and returned to England. This is in 1798. He returned in May, saying that there was no doubt the country was on the brink of rebellion, and that of course is exactly what happened. It's interesting that sometime later Abercromby was in the company of the king, some kind of formal occasion, and George III made a point of steering Abercromby to where some representatives of the Irish Protestant ascendancy were present, and saying in very, very loudly, because George III did have a loud voice, to Abercromby that he had been most disgracefully treated in Ireland. And then afterwards, when the kind of victims, if you like, of this announcement had moved away, he actually, or you can almost imagine him sort of nudging Abercromby in the ribs and saying words to the effect, well, that showed them. Right, so fail in Ireland. Now we come to another foray into the Low Countries, this time into the Northern Netherlands and the Den Helder expedition. Now we're back to Grenville again. This is part of a complicated coalition: Austria, Russia, Britain, also Sardinia, Savoy, various other places. And the idea was that an invasion of Holland would be a distraction. At the same time, Russian troops would invade Switzerland and then attack into France across their eastern frontier, while the Austrians would move down into northern Italy and then across through into Provence. Fair to say, none of that worked, including Den Helder. The biggest problem was that the British in Den Helder, in the Netherlands, were fighting with the Russians. And to put it simply, it just didn't work. The Dutch themselves, as I've already suggested, are very pro-French by this time. So this is one or two of the more cynical British senior officers actually thought it was more of a case that the Dutch were waiting to see who won. They might be right, I don't know, but they certainly weren't going to support the British and the Russians. And although, again, there were some successes, the ultimate result was failure, and in fact the image shows the British and the Russians leaving Den Helder. So, are we making any progress? Well, yes, we are, because Abercrombie was very keen to tell people when he came back that the men that were now coming in from the militia were excellent soldiers, that they really had now men who were ready to make a good army. And that, of course, would accelerate as more and more men came in from the militia. Meanwhile, of course, Napoleon had been putting French flags down in Egypt, he left in August of 99, and obviously led to his victory at Marengo, the end of the Second Coalition, and so on. And I mention that in passing because when eventually we get to the Egypt campaign, and we're very close to it now, Abercromby is given for the first time a clear and simple objective: get the French out of Egypt. They are, of course, stranded because, thanks to Nelson, their navy has been destroyed. And that's why this image suggests Napoleon slipping away, leaving his army behind to presumably twiddle their thumbs. Right, so Abercromby is now sent to the Mediterranean, to Minorca, not originally, excuse me, to deal with Egypt. His main aim, because this is just before the collapse of the Second Coalition, is to support the Austrians in the area of Genoa. And interestingly, his purpose will be to land distracting forces elsewhere down the coast of Italy. These will be men using what we would now recognize as light infantry tactics to draw the French away from Genoa. Before, unfortunately, this could happen, Genoa surrendered. We then move on, Marengo, and to say that there wasn't going to be any further British intervention in Italy. So it was then decided that he could attack Cadiz instead. And this brought him up against certainly one of the most difficult of the senior, officers. And I'm going to have to confess at this moment, it's a terrible, yes, for a moment, my mind had gone blank. This is Admiral Keith. Now, the trouble with Admiral Keith is quite simple. If things went wrong, he always made sure it would be somebody else's fault, not his. And he was quite a difficult man to work with. So they went off to Cadiz. The idea was they would land away from the town, then advance on the town itself. They were warned that there was yellow fever in Cadiz, but nonetheless, Abercromby was still prepared to make the attempt. What became clear, and I think it was some of Keith's subordinates that were providing this information, was that Keith was totally unfamiliar with these waters, and that led Abercromby to think if he wasn't careful, he would be landing a force and then finding himself stranded. So he tried, I think Keith was quite a slippery character, tried to kind of pin him down to get a promise that if that happened, Keith would send boats to get the army off, and Keith would not give that promise. John Moore, who by this time is a very close friend of Abercrombie's, has been with him since the West Indies, writes in his journal how at one point they even burst in on Keith when he was still in bed and tried to get him to an agreement, and he wouldn't give it. So Abercrombie decided he was not going to take the risk. He did not want to have a British army stranded, particularly if Cadiz was, as it was said, suffering from yellow fever. The question was, where next? And it was while the Navy and the men, obviously on the ships, were off Gibraltar, the orders arrived for Egypt. This was on the 24th of October, 1800. Now, what we have here is a picture, a sort of stylized picture of preparations for the landings at Abu Qir Bay. They look very well organised. They were very well organised, and that was actually no accident. For one thing, Abercromby was not going to sail straight to Egypt without some careful preparation for this very straightforward objective as far as what he was asked to do, but not one where he was just going to walk in and snap his fingers and be successful. I need to say at this point that there was already some planning for this, because another force was going to come up from India via the Red Sea up towards Cairo, on the supposition that Abercromby would do the same coming down from the north. Because he had time, Abercromby, or rather Abercromby persuaded Keith, I suppose, to take the force to Marmaris Bay. And the advantage of Marmaris Bay was it bore some resemblance to Aboukir Bay. And what happened here, I think, is a development of what we already saw at the West Indies. Preparation, practice. It's quite notable that the naval side of this practice was delegated to Alexander Cochrane. Abercromby was determined to keep Keith out of it, and he was able to do that by delegating the military side of it to the Quartermaster General Anstruther. So in each case, it's a subordinate who's doing all the practicing. And the practice was how to get men on the beach fast enough before the French could drive them back into the sea. One of the problems at Den Helder had been that, yes, the men did get on the beach, but they were all over the place. Part of this practice would mean that each unit would land at a specific point. The men would know exactly where the rest of their fellows were, and they would form up in double quick time, so to speak. At the same time, Abercromby was drawing in supplies. One of the biggest problems was horses. It was Lord Elgin in the end who supplied them with horses. He was getting local information. Sir Sidney Smith was one of those people, of Accra fame, of course, who was able to give him a lot of information. And he also made sure that the soldiers, who of course were in transports, were landed and enjoyed time on land at regular intervals with a rotation. By the beginning of March, the fleet was at Aboukir, and you can probably just about see it in this image. As they prepared for the landing, they're in 4 lines. We're looking at it from behind the naval ships, which of course can't go any further inland because Aboukir is a shallow bay. So furthest away from us, there are 54 flat boats, each carrying 50 men. Behind them is a line of cutters with troops aboard, then 37 launches with more troops, and 14 launches with 500 sailors, gunners, and 14 field guns. And the thinking is, because obviously the sailors will have to row the men to land, they won't have to row so far back because the next line will be able to move forward, and there will just be a constant feeding of men onto the beach. The actual landing happened on the 8th of March at 3 a.m. There was a rocket signal. 3:30, the boats rowed into position. By 8 a.m., everything was assembled in landing order. And then at 9 a.m., the signal to row to the shore was given. There were some catastrophes. This is the Coldstreamers, but generally the survival rate, bearing in mind that the French had had plenty of time to get their guns into position, were already firing. it actually worked just as Abercromby and his senior officers had hoped. The men landed. Moore was one of those who was there in the first landings. He'd been there when Den Helder proved to be such a confused landing. And he later reported that in no time at all, they were taking the attack to the French, and the French were overwhelmed. The landing was completed. The French, however, and I haven't said much about the unfortunate man who found himself in command, Napoleon had actually left General Kleber, a talented general, in command, but Kleber unfortunately had been murdered by a fanatic who suffered a very nasty punishment, and the next in command was General Menno, who perhaps was not a particularly talented soldier. He was also very loath to listen to advice. Having landed, the next thing, of course, was first of all to make sure that the castle at Aboukir couldn't cause any trouble. That was blockaded. And then to try and lure the French out in order to, well, to defeat them quite clearly. By the 13th, the army had made considerable progress. It was a place called Mandora. And on the 21st, the French eventually decided they had to attack. And this, in fact, I don't know whether you can see it. I hope so. It is, you can see it, I'm sure, the British lines on the left, the French positions on the right. And perhaps the best summary is from a French soldier who in his memoirs wrote, "The English had set up impenetrable defences through which it was impossible to break. Many attacks were made, all were futile. Every trick of war was tried, every effort made, but retreat was inevitable with great loss on both sides." It is fair to say the loss on the French side was somewhat heavier than on the British side. But it was a very well thought out defensive position. This is, of course, the famous occasion when the 28th turned round, let the cavalry gallop through, and then turned and caught them as they were coming back, hence their double badge. Excuse me. But it was also, I think, these were men, they trusted their commander, they trusted themselves, their officers knew them well because, of course, they'd had that long period at Marmaris to get to know each other. This was an army that scented victory even before they fired the first shots. As for casualties, the losses on the British side were 1,500 versus, well, nobody can be quite sure, but at least 4,000 French. So it was perhaps fairly decisive. Unfortunately, however, the principal casualty of the day was General Sir Ralph Abercromby. This is a rather fanciful impression of what happened, although there is an element of truth in it that he was, but it rather looks as if he's dying on the spot. In actual fact, he was able to dismount from his horse, and for quite a long time, sorry, I brought a nasty bug back from Budapest. That's what all the coughing is for. He simply sat under a tree watching the battle, seemed perfectly all right. And then he began to feel very faint, and it was obvious he needed urgent medical treatment. One of his sons was with him. Two of his sons were soldiers, both rose to general, and it was his son John who was with him, and he was able to persuade his father to let himself be carried off the battlefield. He accompanied his father down to the beach, but father then sent son back to do his duty. At this point, one of the officers relieved a soldier of his blanket and gave it to Abercromby to make him more comfortable. And when Abercromby asked what it was, the officer merely replied, "Oh, it's a soldier's blanket." And Abercromby wouldn't accept it because he said, to a soldier, his blanket is one of the most important things he has. He was taken out to Keith's flagship, Foudroyant, and all credit to Keith, gave him every care he could. I don't think there was any bad blood between the two men. As I said, Abercromby was famous for getting on with difficult naval officers. A man, I think, of a very even temper anyway. But unfortunately, the bullet could not be extracted. John Moore, who had also suffered a wound, initially received good news. Everything seemed to be going well. And then suddenly, the battle, I should have said, was fought on the 21st of March. On the 28th of March, Abercromby died, almost certainly from sepsis. As I said to you, there are so many obituaries to this man that I could read. I chose this one simply because it was written by Thomas Walsh, who was a staff officer throughout the campaign, spent a lot of time with Abercromby. And I think it sums up. I don't usually read things that I've put on the screen, but I think this does deserve to be read. A man who has served his country in every quarter of the globe, who as a commander devotes to his troops an attention almost parental, as a soldier shares in all their hardships and all their dangers, who at an age when he might retire from the field crowned with glory, comes forth at the call of his country, a veteran in experience, youthful in ardour, whose life is a public blessing, his death a universal misfortune, is beyond the hackneyed phrase of panegyric. Such a man was Sir Ralph Abercromby. And I think he was a disciplinarian, I should say, but the men knew he cared for them. He was a man who was personally very brave, of that there is no doubt. A man of very equable temper, but nonetheless a man who had very strong principles. He was, I think, in every sense of the word, as the word was understood at that time, he was a gentleman. His death, of course, I suppose, in a sense, didn't make as much difference as it might have done if he'd been a much younger man. As for the Egypt campaign, it went on successfully. His second in command knew what the plan was. As intended, Menu now shut himself up in in Alexandria, and the British, joined at this point by the Turks. Now again, this was not a coalition. This was just act together if it seems a sensible thing to do. March from the north down to Cairo. At the same time, David Baird was coming up from the Red Sea area. Cairo surrendered. Then it was back to Alexandria, and after some defiance which lasted about 10 days, Menu also surrendered. and the French left Egypt on British ships. As for Abercromby, he was buried in Malta, where, in fact, you can still visit his grave. And I think was probably the general of the French Revolutionary Wars. It is a small point just to mention as a closure that of the men who survived from 1801 through to the award of the General Service Medal, that's of course nearly half a century, 50% of them went on to serve in the Peninsular Army. And if we think how many obviously did not make it to the General Service Medal, I think it's fair to say that there was in each regiment that had been in Egypt a hardcore of men who'd benefited from the experience of serving under Sir Ralph Abercrombie. Certainly true of the 30th Foot. They had a very large number of Egypt veterans. And the other thing, of course, is the number of officers who served under him, who are familiar names to him. It was Picton who called himself and others like him Abercrombie's pupils. But we have, of course, Sir John Moore, we have Sir George Murray, we have Rowland Hill, James Kemp, John Hope. It just goes on. These were men who, in their younger days, no doubt learnt something from the possibilities of command from Sir Ralph Abercrombie. Thank you.
Carole, thank you so much. I learned an awful lot this evening. As I often remark, this is not my period of history, and yet some lessons are always timeless. We've had a couple of questions in already, and I'm hoping we might get a few more before we finish.
I just hope I can answer them.
Well, I'm certain you'll be able to do that. I'm going to put the first one up on the screen. And remind people that who are watching in the replay that whilst the live audience can see the question I put up, you in the replay can't. So I'm going to read it out. And the question comes from Marcus de la who's asked what prompted Abercrombie's move from cavalry to infantry in 1781? Was it the prospect of speedy advancement driven by finance or otherwise? Because I think the 103rd Regiment, KIR, only served in Ireland, and the attraction of a new regiment is not obvious.
I think the answer is actually quite simple. It was a way of, it was an army, it was, as Marcus says, always intended to serve in Ireland, and if it served in Ireland, there was no chance of it going across the Atlantic. It was, rather than having to resign his command because he wouldn't fight, I think there was a bit of string pulling, and he got the command in Ireland. He'd been in Ireland before, actually as a much younger man, and actually remembered with some affection. So I think he probably had quite a liking for Ireland, and until, of course, he was landed with the Commander-in-Chief's role. And there, his problems was not with the ordinary Irish, it was definitely with the ascendancy.
Thank you. I think probably at this stage is a good time to mention your book. And if I can just put it up, hopefully. There's I've put under the handout the cover of Carole's book, which is published by Pen and Sword, but is available from the author at an advantageous rate. I think that's probably the right way to say it, Carole.
Definitely.
And therefore, what I've done is I've put in the Carole's email address there. Her website is currently down, so that would give you the opportunity to purchase it from her if that's what you would like to do. I'm going back to the questions just to see if there are any more. It isn't a question from Marcus, but an observation. And what he's observed is Abercrombie's view that the American War was a civil war, but that in Ireland it was a rebellion. Now, does that make sense to you?
I do see, actually, yes. I think that certainly Abercrombie was a great. I think he recognised it was a rebellion in the same way. You could say the parliamentarians in the Civil War in the early stages was a rebellion, but he saw it as a question of. I don't know whether he'd have used the word democracy, but that I think came into it. I say that he knew there was going to be a rebellion in Ireland. I would say his sympathies were probably more with those who, were driven to the point where they were going to rebel, because he just thought that Ireland was being so badly governed. He was, by the way, quite interesting on the French Revolution compared with the American Revolution. Because what struck him about the French Revolution as different from the American Revolution is that the French had no experience of democracy. And therefore, and this is in the very early stages, he could see it all going horribly wrong, whereas he thought the colonists, of course, obviously, they themselves had, in some of them at least, gone to get away from the lack of democracy under some of the Stuarts. So, yes, he could see, and he was a great admirer of Washington as well while he was about it.
Let's put this one up. This is from John, who's asked, do you think Abercrombie's sympathies may have been shaped by his school days in Alloa?
I wouldn't be surprised. I definitely wouldn't be surprised. It was an interesting school for him to have been sent to, but it had a very, very good reputation, but a bit Jacobitish.
Robert's asked a bit of a what if, but if he hadn't died in Egypt, was Abercrombie at the end of his career, or would he have gone on to greater things?
No, he had promised his wife that this would be his last campaign. She was a very long-suffering lady, and they were actually a surprisingly long-lived family. His father only died in 1800, so I suppose he probably was. Well, the point is often made that he was surprisingly fit for a man of his age. But no, he had said, this is it. This is the last one.
Well, that actually brings a question at the back of my mind was that when you cover his early career, it seemed to me you were describing a man who had actually reached the pinnacle of his career and was looking forward to retirement. So what brought him back? Was it the Scottish connection with Dundas? Why was he preferred?
I think that had something to do with it, and there's no doubt as the Revolutionary Wars went on, he became Dundas's favourite general. I mean, and I don't think it was just because Dundas, you might imagine, was absolutely devastated by his death. And he actually told Pitt that they'd both been looking to that stage. They were now ready to retire, and they'd spend their last years together mulling over this, that, and whatever you do mull over when you get to that age.
Yeah. Carole, thank you so much. I think we've run out of questions at this stage, which is probably appropriate because we normally allocate about an hour and 15 minutes to an hour and a half. So we've come to that time where it's probably appropriate to draw stumps. But on behalf of the audience, I know that you closed your chat box, but if you want to open it very briefly,
I'm not even sure how I do open it.
It's that right button at the top. Yeah.
Oh, right.
Click on that, it opens it up. And there you've got people just showing how appreciative. You've left the stage, Carole. And at that stage, therefore, I will pass on all of those messages to Carole tomorrow morning. Thank you all very much. Our speaker for June has had to be changed, but it will be on a subject of the First World War. And as soon as the dates have been confirmed by the Secretary, we will set up a registration page. But for this evening, it just remains for me to say thank you all for attending, and hopefully see many of you next month. Bye-bye.